All right, hey, good morning, everybody. As I said in my intro, my name's Ben. Again, I'm on the elder board. Again, just because people really like my wife. I teach at a Tascadero High School where I teach history, social science, and that's really why I'm here today, is as in my role as a social scientist. And we just want to talk about a little kind of historical context for how we get to our modern political system. And I'm really going to take a big, brief overview here. But before I do, I love the idea of this conference. And the idea of this conference is that in an ever more politically divided and divisive world, that we as Christians are called to speak lovingly into people's lives, to be understanding of people we disagree with, to be in relationship with it. And even if you don't think as a Christian, even if you're just thinking as a political animal, I always think about what Abraham Lincoln said, and that is that the best way to defeat my enemy is to make him my friends. The real goal of politics, if you have a strong opinion politically, should not be to defeat your enemy. It should be to convert your enemy. It should be to win them over to your side. And certainly we're not going to win people over to our side with a club and a clubbing. So how do we win them over? And so I just want to anecdotally just share the fact that I being a social scientist, I find myself regularly in these conversations about politics, and I'm here to vouch for the fact that it can be done. My colleague who teaches right next door to me, we are at utter, complete opposite ends of the political spectrum, and yet we're good friends, and we get along well, and we have great conversations, and we do plenty of disagreeing with each other in the process, but we never lose faith in the fact that we're bad people, we're good people, we just disagree with each other's ideas. Matter of fact, political polls tend to bear that out, that it used to be that people who disagreed with each other politically were people who thought that person is a good person, they just have bad ideas. Unfortunately, we've now degenerated into belief that the only way to disagree with me politically is to be a bad person. And we know that that's just not the Christian model. So these conversations can be and should be had. Just another more kind of joking one, interesting one, laughable one, is one time I was hiking up with my family up Mount Lassen, which is about 10,000 feet high, and about 9,500 feet high. One of my children decided that this was producing a little bit too much fear in them, that we're getting a little too dangerous. So I stopped, and my wife and my other child go to the top of the mountain. And in the meantime, this woman sits down next to me, and as randomly often happens with me, kind of said, well, gee, I'm politically X. And I said, well, gee, that's interesting. I'm politically the opposite of that. Let's talk about that. And probably about 45 minutes later, when my wife finally came back down the mountain, the woman looked at my wife and said, wow, I really had an enjoyable conversation with your husband. And the point is not to pat myself on the back, but it's to just reiterate that we can have conversations with people we disagree with and still have them in a loving, respectful way. And so, who knows, maybe we even win somebody over to our side of the argument. Having said that, what I want to do is just give a brief historical overview of like how we got here. Because the interesting thing is, for most of history, there is no political opinion to have. We got a king. And we work for the king, and the king tells us what to do, and our job is to be quiet and do what the king says. However, here in the Western world, we've had this interesting arc of change that started with the Renaissance and some isms like individualism, humanism, and secularism. And those words today take on a very anti-religious tone. But back when they started, they were all promoted by church people who said, hey, instead of just waiting for heaven, let's try to make the world in front of us a better place. And so that's kind of our lead into starting to believe that we should actually be involved in the process. And the big one that almost everybody thinks of is the Enlightenment. And in the Enlightenment, of course, now we start to question whether we should have a king at all. Right? And maybe we can do this for ourselves. And probably the thinker of all the many Enlightenment philosophers that I think of most is John Locke, who basically says, we don't work for the king works for us. So he wasn't necessarily saying get rid of a king, but he was saying that the king should be working for us. And then we know that from the Enlightenment come these mini revolutions, right? The one that you think about, of course, is the American Revolution. And it's the one that we so romantically think of. And we'll get to that one in a second. But actually before that is the English Civil War and Glorious Revolution, which doesn't create a democracy, but does put a lot of limits on the king. We call it a constitutional monarchy. So now the people at least have some kind of say-so in this whole process. Then we do, of course, get to the American Revolution, which we so romantically think of and love. And we think of the fact that, man, now we're going to get rid of a king altogether. Okay? And we do. And has been a pretty successful experiment in the broad sense, right? The one that didn't turn out so great was the French Revolution, right? That followed the American Revolution, that now ended with the guillotine and tens of thousands of people getting their heads chopped off. And instead of ending with a democracy, we ended with a ruthless dictator named Napoleon. And my point here is to make out that democracy, the idea, is not necessarily just the Christian idea. I'm not saying that democracy is not deeply rooted in Judeo-Christianity. It is. The worth of the individual, their image of God, all of those different kind of things. However, my point is when we get to our modern politics, we like to think that it's all founded on a Judeo-Christian belief system, but unfortunately it's not. Enlightenment thinker Voltaire created the idea of deism, the idea that, well, God may have made the universe, but he's not running around tinkering in our daily lives, so we shouldn't rely on him. We should roll up our sleeves and study the world for ourselves and figure out for ourselves the way to run it. And there's a big debate amongst U.S. historians. Is America really a Christian nation, or are they more a deist nation? And of course, many of our founding fathers truly were Christians trying to live out a Christian life. And some of them were definitely influenced by deism. Probably the most well thought of our revolutionary leaders, Thomas Jefferson. He actually took the Bible and he did what some of us would like to do, which is to say, well, I like this part, but I don't really like that part, and basically turned it into his own version of the Bible called the Jeffersonian Bible, which is clearly not what we as Christians believe. We don't get to pick and choose which parts of the Bible we like and which parts we don't. And so at least one of our most fondly remembered founding fathers was pretty heavily influenced by deism. I'm not here to settle the debate between the historians who say we're a Christian nation and those who say we're a deist. I'm here to say we're at least a little bit of both. Okay? I bring up the French Revolution because the French Revolution was most deeply based on the ideas of humanism. And humanism is the idea that, similarly, we don't really need God to solve the world's problems. Again, we can do it ourselves. We can come together as humans and we can solve all the world's problems. And I would argue personally that had a lot to do with why it ended in a disaster, because we abandoned needing to rely on God and said, we're just going to do this ourselves. The English Civil War and Glorious Revolution, right, was much more based on a Protestant formation, and it had its bloodshed and its problems. However, right, the British have had a much more gradual, even-handed transition peacefully to democracy than the French had, in part, I would argue, because the French abandoned God as the source of what we need to really hang our hat on, to take to the bank, to trust in order to move forward. Okay? So, speaking of which, let's get to when we talk about political right and left, where do we actually get that terminology? We actually get that terminology from a French tennis court. If you don't know, in the French Revolution, right, there were the people who wanted to conserve, preserve, keep the king, just make some minor changes. Those people sat on the right-hand side of a tennis court, conservative. The people who wanted to get rid of the king altogether, they were liberal. They wanted a bigger change. They sat on the left-hand side of the tennis court. So we actually get the political terminology of right and left from a French tennis court. After the king kicked them out of a meeting, they had to go someplace, they went to the tennis court. And so, with that kind of context in front of us, what I really then want to talk about is just what are some reasons to be careful about putting all our eggs in the political basket. why we need to remind ourselves all the more, all the time, that we need to put our faith in God, our faith in Jesus, and do that first and foremost before we ever make a political decision. And while we have to be careful because the political sands continue to shift at all times, and that's precisely the point. We can always trust in God, but we have to be careful about trusting in politics. And so, for instance, first, just that. Politics is ever shifting and changing. Something that is conservative one day becomes liberal the next. And we could come up with a whole bunch of examples. Let me just give one from the very beginning. And from the very beginning, the guy who came up with the economic liberal original idea was a guy by the name of Adam Smith. That's capitalism, free enterprise. Something that today is not the liberal position, it's the conservative position, right? Why? Because shortly after economic liberalism, free enterprise, capitalism comes about, right? Then comes along socialism and communism. So now those are the liberal and radical ideas. So what was liberal, capitalism, now becomes conservative. Speaking of which, why, right, those things come out there? Both of our political parties, I would argue, to a certain degree, what separates, and I know Mr. Zippy is going to do a great job of talking about the political spectrum, right and left, and he's going to talk about different ways in there. But just one thing I would highlight would be the idea of what we're afraid of, right? I would say that one of the many ways to look at our political parties is about what do they fear? If you're on the political right, you are more likely to fear the government, right? This was about we're going to get rid of a king and have democracy because we're afraid of government tyranny. Why the rise of socialism and communism? Because on the political left, you're afraid of a new monster, and that is the factory and the big business owner, right? The corporation. And so the political left tends to have a greater fear of the corporation. But don't miss the point I'm trying to make. They're both afraid of something. They're actually not that different. It's a question of what or who they fear more. Remember, as Christians, perfect love casts out fear. Well, we shouldn't fear anything, right? Because we know the author of it all. And so therefore, that's another reason as kind of a cautionary tale about getting too embedded politically. Remember, and I'm going to end this with a clear call, I'm not telling us not to be politically active. I'm not telling us not to be politically involved. I certainly am very politically involved. I exercise my voting rights, and I certainly try to convince people to my point of view. However, I always try to do it by reminding myself who my real authority is. And so another thing we want to keep in mind, besides what we fear, is this idea of we have to be careful. Many of our politicians will appeal to the Christian message and their Christianity, so to speak. And what I'm certainly not here to do today is to question anybody's Christianity or how sincerely they believe it. However, just a reminder of a concept called cultural Christianity. Let's face it, let's go back before the printing press. Almost everybody was relying entirely on the priest to interpret the Bible for them. And so while they all were called Christians throughout Europe and the Western world, right, that really they weren't even sure themselves because most of them couldn't read. They had to rely on the priest to tell them what they were supposed to think and believe. And so even today, I would make us cautious of the concept of cultural Christianity, that many people give moral assent to the idea of Christianity while never going to church, never spending time in prayer, never reading a Bible, right? And or just pandering to people who are Christians for the sake of getting their vote, regardless of whether it's their sincere belief or not, or whether they're really taking God into account when they're trying to make their political decisions, right? So just be cautious and always remember that there's a lot of authentic Christians out there who may want your vote, but there's also a lot of cultural Christians out there that probably aren't making their decisions based off of prayer, scripture, right, and keeping God at the forefront in their mind. And also just that reminder of humanism, right, that we live in a world that is deeply humanistic, that believes that humans are able to do great things. And of course, People can do some great things, but therefore, unfortunately, often do it at the expense of putting God first in their thinking. Excuse me. So as I keep things relatively short today, and I don't want to go on as long, I'd rather keep this short and give it something to think about. The last thing to remind us is this. Prohibition didn't solve drunkenness in America. You name the law, right? Whatever other law it is, it hasn't solved the problem. The problem exists deep in human hearts. And no matter what law we pass, there's really only one answer to truly solve the problem of the human heart. And that's in the Bible. And that's the story of Jesus. And that's the whole reason why we're here. So, yes, go out there and make political decisions. Go out there and vote. And yes, go out there and try to convert people to your cause. But I want to end where I started, right? That a reminder, Jesus said it best, but I do love the words of Abraham Lincoln, right? That said, the best way to defeat my enemy is to make him my friend. No one's going to turn to your side of the political aisle because you beat them over the head with a club, right? We all know that. We know that deep down, just like being a Christian requires deep relationships and effort in those relationships, it's the same way in politics, right? If we really want people to come to our side, we need to speak loving conversations. By all means, speak the truth, but speak it in love, as we are called to do as Christians, right? And so that is my prayer for you guys today, is that we can go out and engage in those conversations and, yes, be involved in the political process, but never forgetting where our true allegiance is. Thank you guys very much for joining me. I hope it was helpful. I hope it was informative. Thanks.